Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Now, let me paint you a picture of a world where the simple act of finding your next meal could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine waking up to the sound of church bells cutting through the morning mist. But instead of calling the faithful to prayer, they're tolling a warning. The harvest has failed again. The stores of grain that should have lasted through winter are nearly gone, and it's only autumn. This is medieval Europe, where famine stalked the land like a predator, and the common people had to become masters of survival just to see another dawn. Today, we are going to uncover the ingenious, desperate, and sometimes disturbing ways medieval people managed to survive when the specter of starvation loomed over their villages. These weren't just random acts of desperation. Over centuries of recurring famines, medieval communities developed sophisticated survival strategies that reveal the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. From the careful rationing systems that could stretch meager supplies for months, to the forage foods that could keep a family alive when all else failed, to the social networks that meant the difference between community survival and total collapse. But perhaps most fascinating of all, we'll discover how medieval people didn't just survive famines. They created systems to predict them, prepare for them, and emerge from them stronger than before. By the end of our time together, you'll understand why some medieval communities thrived while others perished, and how the lessons learned in those hungry centuries echo through our understanding of survival even today. The medieval world was a place where the margin between abundance and starvation could be measured in a single failed harvest. Unlike our modern world with its global food networks and emergency aid systems, medieval communities were largely isolated, dependent on what they could grow within a day's walk of their village. When crops failed, when livestock died, when the rains didn't come or came too hard, entire regions could find themselves facing a crisis that would test every survival skill they had developed over generations. Famine wasn't just about empty stomachs. It was a cascade of interconnected crises that could tear apart the very fabric of medieval society. When food became scarce, prices soared beyond what common people could afford. Social tensions erupted as communities struggled to decide who would eat and who would go without. Disease followed hunger like a shadow, preying on weakened bodies and overcrowded conditions. And yet somehow, medieval people found ways not just to endure these trials, but to build systems that could help their communities weather the storm. The first, and perhaps most crucial survival strategy medieval people developed was the art of reading the signs. Long before the science of meteorology, medieval farmers became expert observers of natural patterns. They watched the behavior of animals, noted the thickness of tree bark, observed the timing of bird migrations, and tracked the phases of the moon with an accuracy that would impress modern scientists. These weren't superstitions, but carefully developed systems of prediction based on generations of observation. Village elders maintained detailed mental records of weather patterns, crop yields, and survival strategies that had worked in previous famines. They knew that certain combinations of weather signs meant trouble was coming, sometimes months in advance. A particularly harsh winter followed by a late spring, unusual insect behavior, or changes in the color and timing of autumn leaves could all signal that the next harvest might fail. This early warning system gave communities precious time to prepare.
When the signs pointed toward potential famine, medieval communities activated a complex web of preparation strategies that had been refined over centuries. The first priority was always food preservation and storage. Medieval people were masters of making food last, using techniques that we're only now rediscovering in our modern world. They knew exactly how to salt meat so it would remain edible for months, how to dry fruits and vegetables to concentrate their nutrients, and how to store greens in ways that would protect them from moisture, pests, and theft. But preservation was just the beginning. Medieval communities also maintained detailed knowledge of what we might call famine foods, plants, roots, bark, and other natural resources that could sustain life when traditional crops failed. Every village had its foragers, usually older women who had inherited generations of knowledge about which wild plants were edible, which parts of trees could be ground into flour, and how to prepare foods that might otherwise be toxic or indigestible. The social dimension of famine survival was perhaps even more sophisticated than the technical aspects. Medieval communities developed intricate systems of mutual aid and resource sharing that could help everyone survive even the worst shortages. These weren't just informal arrangements between neighbors, but carefully structured agreements that had been tested and refined through previous crises. During times of plenty, communities would establish what we might think of as insurance systems. Wealthier families would contribute extra grain to communal stores, knowing that in exchange, they could count on community support if their own fortunes turned. The church played a crucial role in these networks, not just as a moral authority encouraging charity, but as a practical coordinator of resources and aid. When famine struck, these social networks activated with remarkable efficiency. Food would be rationed not just within individual families, but across entire communities. Decisions about who received how much food were made collectively, taking into account factors like age, health, pregnancy, and the essential work someone performed for community survival.
It wasn't always fair by our modern standards, but it was a system designed to maximize the number of people who would survive until the next harvest. The medieval approach to famine survival also included remarkable innovations in food production and resource management. When traditional crops failed, communities knew how to quickly shift to alternative food sources that could be grown or gathered more reliably. They maintained seed stocks of hardy grains that could grow in poor conditions, knew which wild plants could be cultivated quickly, and had systems for managing livestock that could provide protein even during the worst shortages. Medieval people understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern abundance, that survival often depends not on having the best of everything, but on having enough of what you need and knowing how to make it last. Their approach to famine survival was built on redundancy, flexibility, and community cooperation in ways that offer profound lessons for our own uncertain times. As we continue our exploration of medieval survival strategies, we'll discover how these remarkable people turned the darkest chapters of their history into opportunities for innovation, community building, and resilience that would serve them for generations to come. Yet, even the most sophisticated survival strategies could not shield medieval communities from the harsh arithmetic of scarcity. When the carefully preserved stores ran low and the wild foods were stripped from the land, harder choices lay ahead. The path from abundance to starvation was not a sudden cliff, but a gradual descent marked by increasingly desperate measures that tested the very fabric of human society. The first casualties of prolonged famine were always the most vulnerable. Children whose small bodies demanded frequent nourishment began to show the telltale signs of malnutrition within weeks. Their bright eyes grew dull, their laughter faded to weak whimpers, and their once plump cheeks hollowed into gaunt shadows. Mothers would portion out ever smaller meals, saving the choicest morsels for their little ones, while gnawing on scraps of bread so hard they could barely be chewed. The elderly, already weakened by years of toil, found their strength ebbing away like water through cracked earth. In these darkest hours, communities faced choices that would have been unthinkable in times of plenty. Families began to fracture under the weight of impossible decisions. Should the last handful of grain go to the strongest son, who might yet survive to work the fields when abundance returned, or to the weakest child, who would surely perish without it? Some parents made the agonizing choice to abandon infants they could no longer feed, leaving them at monastery gates with desperate prayers that the Holy Brothers might find sustenance where they could not. The social hierarchies that had seemed so rigid in times of plenty began to crumble like poorly mortared stone. Desperate peasants, driven by the primal need to feed their families, began to eye the granaries of their lords with new calculation. The respect and deference that had bound the feudal system together for generations dissolved in the face of empty stomachs and dying children. Riots erupted as starving crowds stormed the estates of nobles, demanding access to stores that had been carefully hoarded while common folk perished. Yet, even as some communities descended into chaos, others discovered reservoirs of resilience that surprised themselves. In the villages where mutual aid networks had been strongest before the famine, new forms of cooperation emerged from the crucible of shared suffering. Neighbors who had once competed for the best plots of land now pooled their remaining resources with mathematical precision, calculating how to stretch every last grain to keep the maximum number of people alive until the next harvest. The church, despite its own struggles with dwindling tithes and empty coffers, often served as the backbone of these collective survival efforts. Monasteries became islands of organization in seas of chaos, their disciplined communities uniquely equipped to manage scarce resources with methodical care. Monks who had spent years practicing the spiritual discipline of fasting now applied that same austere wisdom to the grim mathematics of rationing. They established soup kitchens that served thin but nutritious broths to endless lines of hollow-eyed supplicants, each portion carefully measured to provide just enough sustenance to sustain life without depleting the precious stores too quickly. The psychological toll of prolonged hunger was perhaps even more devastating than the physical effects. As weeks turned into months of inadequate nutrition, the very personalities of the starving began to change. Kind-hearted farmers became suspicious and paranoid, hoarding scraps of food with the intensity of misers counting gold. Children learned to lie about their hunger with disturbing skill, while adults found themselves capable of betrayals that would have horrified their well-fed selves. The constant gnawing pain of empty stomachs was accompanied by an even more insidious erosion of hope as people began to wonder if the suffering would ever end. Yet, amid this landscape of desperation, individual acts of heroism shone like candles in the darkness. There were those who shared their last crusts of bread with strangers, who carried water to the sick when they could barely stand themselves, who sang lullabies to orphan children even as their own voices grew weak with hunger. These quiet saints, whose names history has largely forgotten, kept the flame of human dignity alive when everything else seemed to be failing. The strategies for survival during the worst phases of famine required a complete reimagining of what constituted food. Tree bark, carefully prepared and ground into a coarse flour, became a staple in many households. The inner bark of birch, pine, and oak trees, when properly processed, could provide enough nutrition to keep people alive, though it offered little satisfaction to cramping stomachs. Grass and leaves were boiled into bitter teas that provided some vitamins, while roots and tubers that would normally be left for animals became precious commodities fought over in forest clearings. Even leather goods were not spared from the desperate search for sustenance. Old shoes, belts, and harnesses were boiled for hours to extract whatever protein might remain in the hide. The resulting broth was thin and unpalatable, but it represented calories that could mean the difference between life and death. Some communities developed elaborate techniques for preparing these unconventional foods, sharing knowledge that passed from household to household like secret recipes for survival. This mental adjustment was perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of famine survival, requiring people to fundamentally redefine their relationship with food and sustenance. As the famine wore on, even these desperate measures began to fail. The forests were stripped of edible bark. The fields gleaned of every possible root and tuber. It was at this point that the most extreme survival strategies emerged, practices so terrible that they were spoken of only in whispers, if at all. Some communities resorted to consuming the leather from book bindings in monastery libraries, carefully soaking and boiling the ancient parchments and their bindings to extract any possible nutrition.